There is a stone in Lebanon that no crane built today can lift, not because the engineering does not exist on paper, not because the physics are unclear, but because the practical machinery required to move a single block of this size, one solid piece of limestone weighing somewhere between 800 and 1,600 tons, depending on which survey you trust, does not currently exist in operational form anywhere on Earth. The block is still there. It has been sitting in the same quarry outside Baalbek for somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years. It was never moved, and the people who cut it, who shaped its lower face with remarkable precision, simply walked away one day and left it in the ground. We do not know why they stopped. That single unanswered question, not the size of the stone, not the age, but the silence of the abandonment, is where this story begins. Picture a construction site in ancient Rome, around 60 years before the Common Era. Roman engineers, among the most capable builders the ancient world ever produced, are laying the foundation for a temple complex at Baalbek, a place they called Heliopolis, the city of the sun. They are confident, organized, extraordinarily skilled, and then they encounter something already in the ground beneath them. 3 stones, each weighing roughly 800 tons, already cut, already placed, already forming a platform so precisely leveled that the Romans simply build on top of it. They do not question it in any surviving record. They do not describe moving these stones. They find them there, and they use them. Those 3 stones are called the trilithon. They remain in place today, and no one, not the Romans, not the engineers of the 19th century, not the teams working with modern heavy equipment, has produced a verified, physically tested method for transporting limestone blocks of that mass over any meaningful distance. That is not a fringe claim. That is the current state of the engineering literature. Now move 10,000 kilometers to the west and travel back 9,000 years before those Roman builders ever set foot in Baalbek. In the highlands of what is now southeastern Turkey, at a place called Göbekli Tepe, someone was carving massive limestone pillars, some of them weighing up to 10 tons, and arranging them in precise circular enclosures, decorated with detailed animal reliefs. The people doing this had no pottery, no writing, no agriculture in the conventional sense. By every model of human development that existed before 1996, they should not have been capable of organized monumental construction. The site was deliberately buried, every enclosure filled in carefully with rubble and soil, sealed and hidden, long before any civilization we recognize by name had formed. We do not know why they buried it. Across the Pacific, on a remote island in the southeastern corner of the ocean, 887 stone figures stand or lie across a landscape of volcanic rock. The largest of them weighs 82 tons. They were carved from a single inland quarry, moved to coastal platforms across distances of up to 11 miles, and raised upright without metal tools, without wheels, and without any written record of how the work was organized. Some of them have bodies, full torsos, buried beneath the surface for centuries, undisturbed, covered in carved symbols whose meaning remains, as of this recording, entirely unknown. These are not myths. These are documented, surveyed, radiocarbon-dated physical places that you can visit, stand next to, and photograph. The mystery is not whether they exist. The mystery is what they tell us about the people who built them, people whose full capabilities we have not yet understood. Before we go further, if you have found your way to this channel, and this kind of quiet, careful exploration of history is what you are looking for, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. This channel moves slowly and deliberately, the way the best questions deserve to be treated, and every new episode continues somewhere the last one left off. Welcome, we are glad you are here, because what comes next is not a single answer. It is 7 open doors, and behind each one, the silence is older and deeper and more carefully preserved than almost anyone has been willing to admit. Let's start with a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. How do you cut a perfect right angle into a stone block using tools made of stone, bone, and bronze? The answer, according to most conventional explanations of ancient construction, is that you do it slowly, patiently. With enough workers, enough time, and enough organizational intelligence, human hands and primitive tools can achieve results that look, to modern eyes, almost impossible. That answer is reasonable. It has worked as an explanation for most ancient sites around the world. But Puma Punku is not most ancient sites. And the deeper you look at what was actually found there, the more the standard explanation begins to strain under the weight of what it is being asked to account for. Puma Punku sits on the Bolivian Altiplano at an elevation of approximately 12,800 feet above sea level, roughly the same altitude as the summit of some of the highest peaks in the continental United States. The air is thin, the landscape is flat, treeless, and exposed. It is one of the more inhospitable places on Earth to organize large-scale construction, and yet someone chose this location, gathered an enormous workforce, quarried stone from sources located dozens of miles away, and built something so precisely engineered that modern researchers are still struggling to fully account for the methods involved. The site is part of the broader Tiwanaku complex, a pre-Columbian civilization that flourished in this region between roughly 500 and 900 of the Common Era, based on accelerator mass spectrometry, radiocarbon dating, conducted at multiple independent laboratories. Tiwanaku, at its peak, was one of the most significant urban centers in the ancient Americas, with a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people in the urban core. Alexei Vranich, an archaeologist at the University of California, Berkeley, who has spent years excavating and studying the site, has described Tiwanaku as a genuinely sophisticated state-level society with complex administrative systems, long-distance trade networks, and a remarkably advanced understanding of hydraulic engineering. None of that is controversial. The controversy lives specifically in the stones of Puma Punku itself. The blocks at Puma Punku are cut from two types of stone. The first is red sandstone, which is relatively soft and workable with tools available to the Tiwanaku culture. The second, and far more problematic, is grey andesite, a volcanic rock so hard that it scores a 6 on the Mohs hardness scale, meaning it is harder than steel. You cannot scratch andesite with an iron nail. You cannot easily score it with a bronze chisel. Working it requires sustained, precise application of force, using materials of equal or greater hardness, which the Tiwanaku, by the current archaeological record, did not possess in abundance. And yet the andesite blocks at Puma Punku are cut with what can only be described as mechanical precision. Archaeologists have noted that the H-shaped blocks, a distinctive interlocking form found repeated across the site, display interior angles consistently accurate to within a fraction of a degree. The flat surfaces are smooth to a degree that requires either an abrasive finishing process of remarkable consistency or a cutting method that leaves no visible tool marks. Some blocks contain long, straight grooves running their entire length, uniform in width and depth, that have been compared in form to modern router cuts. Others contain blind holes, cylindrical depressions that do not pass through the stone drilled to a consistent diameter and depth, with walls that show no evidence of the spiraling scratch marks you would expect from a manually operated drill. Let that sit for a moment. Blind cylindrical holes, cut into andesite, with smooth interior walls, at a site dated to roughly the 6th century of the Common Era, using a culture whose known tool inventory consists primarily of stone hammers, bone implements, and small bronze chisels. What remains unexplained is not the existence of the holes. It is how the interior walls are as smooth as they are. One theory suggests that the Tiwanaku used a combination of harder stone, abrading tools, quartzite, or obsidian combined with sand and water as a cutting medium, applied with wooden or bone templates that guided the abrasion along precise paths. This is a legitimate and physically plausible explanation. Abrasive cutting with quartz, sand, and water can, given sufficient time and skilled application, produce surfaces of remarkable smoothness, even in very hard stone. The ancient Egyptians used comparable techniques. The argument is well reasoned and supported by experimental archaeology. The difficulty is replication. No team, as of the most recent published literature, has successfully replicated an H-block to the tolerances observed at Puma Punku, using only the tool types confirmed present in the Tiwanaku archaeological record. That does not prove the task was impossible. It means the proof of concept remains incomplete. John Janusek, an archaeologist at Vanderbilt University, who has conducted extensive fieldwork in the Tiwanaku region, has argued that the organizational sophistication of the Tiwanaku state is systematically underestimated. and that the construction achievements at Puma Punku represent the output of a highly coordinated labor system operating over generations rather than a single construction event. Alan Kalata at the University of Chicago, whose work on Tiwanaku hydraulic systems and agricultural terracing demonstrated a level of environmental engineering far beyond what earlier researchers suspected, has made similar arguments about the capacity of Andean state societies to mobilize and direct skilled labor at scale. These are serious scholars making serious arguments. Their position deserves the same weight as the unresolved technical questions, and more than it typically receives in popular media coverage of this site. The transportation problem is separate from the cutting problem, and in some ways more straightforward to analyze, though not necessarily easier to resolve. The grey andesite used at Puma Punku does not come from anywhere near the site. The nearest confirmed andesite quarry is located on the Copacabana Peninsula, on the far side of Lake Titicaca, approximately 90 kilometers away. The red sandstone quarries have been identified roughly 10 kilometers distant. Moving the sandstone blocks overland with rope, wooden sledges, and human labor is plausible and consistent with methods documented at other ancient sites worldwide. Moving multi-ton andesite blocks 90 kilometers across open water, or around the lake's edge across difficult terrain, using only pre-industrial technology, is considerably more challenging to model convincingly. One theory suggests the use of reed boats or balsa wood rafts on Lake Titicaca for the water crossing, combined with log roller systems for overland transport. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that reed watercraft of this type can carry substantial loads. The logistical coordination required would have been extraordinary, but not, proponents argue, beyond the administrative capacity of the Tiwanaku state. What remains unexplained is the loading and unloading process for multi-ton stones being transferred between water transport and land transport at lake margins without the benefit of fixed crane infrastructure. This is not an impossible problem, but no one has worked through the full operational sequence in a way that accounts for all of the site's heaviest blocks. Then there is the question of the largest single block at Puma Punku. One red sandstone block at the site has been measured and estimated to weigh approximately 131 tons. It was moved, somehow, from a quarry roughly 10 kilometers away. It is not the most precisely cut stone at the site. The andesite H blocks hold that distinction, but its mass alone places it in a category of objects that require serious logistical planning to move even by modern standards. For context, a standard modern construction crane, the kind you see on urban building sites, typically has a maximum lift capacity of somewhere between 20 and 50 tons. Moving a 131-ton block requires either specialized heavy lift equipment, a system of distributed force using many smaller pulling points simultaneously, or a method we have not yet fully modeled for this site. It is worth pausing here to address the version of this story that most people encounter first. Puma Punku has been featured extensively in television programming that attributes its construction to extraterrestrial visitors. This claim is not supported by any peer-reviewed evidence. It has been criticized not only by mainstream archaeologists, but by researchers specifically engaged in evaluating alternative theories of ancient construction. The alien hypothesis, beyond its evidentiary problems, also carries an implicit and troubling assumption that the indigenous peoples of the Bolivian Altiplano could not have built this. That assumption says more about the biases of modern observers than about the capabilities of the Tiwanaku. What the evidence actually supports is something genuinely more interesting. A pre-Columbian Andean civilization operating in a resource-constrained high-altitude environment developed construction methods precise enough to produce results that remain, in specific technical details, not fully explained by any published experimental replication. That is a real mystery. It does not require embellishment. Archaeologists have noted that Puma Punku shows signs of sudden, violent disruption, blocks scattered as if by catastrophic force. Some evidence consistent with earthquake damage, some with deliberate destruction during the collapse of the Tiwanaku state, around 900 of the Common Era. The site as we find it today is not the site as it was built. We are looking at wreckage, and some portion of what we cannot explain may be the result of incomplete information pieces missing from the puzzle because they were lost in that disruption, not because they were never there. That is the honest position to hold about Puma Punku, not certainty in either direction. not the comfort of a clean answer, but a genuine, documented, quietly persistent set of questions that the best researchers in the field have not yet fully resolved. The stones are still there, still precise, still waiting, and we are still, after more than a century of serious archaeological investigation, still working out what they mean. And we are still, after more than a century of serious archaeological investigation, still working out what they mean. Before we move on, something about this particular mystery always makes me curious about the people on the other side of it. Where are you right now as you are listening to this? Is it late where you are, the kind of quiet late, where the rest of the house has gone still, and this is the only voice in the room? Or is it early morning, the world outside not quite awake yet, and this is how you are easing into the day? Maybe it is somewhere in the middle, a commute, a walk, an afternoon that needed something to fill it with. Drop it in the comments if you feel like it. The city, the hour, whatever you want to share. There is something genuinely strange and worth noticing about the fact that a 1,200-year-old puzzle on a Bolivian plateau at 13,000 feet is the thing connecting all of us right now, across however many time zones are represented in that comment section. That thought, the idea of something ancient quietly reaching forward across centuries to land in your earbuds on a Tuesday morning or a Friday night, is exactly what the next site is going to deepen considerably. Most people think they already know the story of the Great Pyramid, and that is precisely the problem. The version most of us carry around, the one about pharaohs and burial chambers, and hundreds of thousands of slaves hauling limestone blocks across the desert, is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it functions almost like a wall. It sits between us and the actual questions, and the actual questions, it turns out, are considerably stranger than the story we were handed in school. Here is the thing that does not get said enough. After thousands of years of study, after every excavation, every survey, every modern imaging technology applied to this structure, we still do not know what the Great Pyramid was actually for, not with certainty, not in the way we know what the Parthenon was for, or the Colosseum, or Notre Dame. We have a theory, a widely accepted, institutionally endorsed, textbook printed theory. But a theory is not the same as an answer, and inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, there are at least three things that the theory does not explain. Three things that have been physically measured, photographed, published in peer-reviewed journals, and quietly filed away under the heading of questions we have not yet resolved. That is where this part of the story lives. Start with the most basic fact that tends to get lost in the spectacle of the exterior. The Great Pyramid, built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu around 2,560 years before the Common Era, is the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. It held the record as the tallest structure on Earth for approximately 3,800 years, from its completion until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in England, around 1100 of the Common Era. Its base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 440-foot length on each side. The 4 faces are oriented to true north, south, east, and west, with a deviation of less than 1/15 of a single degree. These are not estimates. These are surveyed measurements. Now here is what the survey does not tell you. Despite being the most documented ancient structure in the world, despite being the subject of scientific investigation stretching back to the Napoleonic expedition of 1798, the Great Pyramid has never yielded a single mummy. No body, no sarcophagus containing remains, no treasure in the conventional tomb sense, no inscriptions on its interior walls, which is remarkable given that virtually every other Egyptian burial structure of this period is covered in hieroglyphic text. Archaeologists have noted this absence for generations. The standard explanation is that the pyramid was robbed in antiquity, the mummy and its associated treasures removed long before modern investigators arrived. This is plausible, but it leaves an uncomfortable residual question. If the interior was robbed, why does the arrangement of the internal chambers not match the functional logic of a tomb? Why are there shafts that lead nowhere? Why is there a passage that descends into the bedrock and simply stops, unfinished, as if someone changed the architectural plan partway through construction? And why, most pressingly, is there a hidden chamber inside this structure that no one has entered in recorded history? In the autumn of 2017, A team of physicists from the High Energy Accelerator Research Organization in Japan, known as KEK, working in collaboration with the HIP Institute in Paris, published results in the journal Nature that stopped the archaeological world briefly in its tracks. Using a technique called muon tomography, the same basic principle used to image the interior of nuclear reactors and volcanoes, involving cosmic ray particles that penetrate solid matter and can be detected on the other side, the team had found a large void inside the Great Pyramid, located above the Grand Gallery, that did not correspond to any known chamber or passage. They called it the Big Void. It is estimated to be at least 100 feet long. As of the time this is being recorded, it remains sealed. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities acknowledged the finding. The Scan Pyramids project, which conducted the survey, is a collaboration between Egyptian authorities, French and Japanese universities, and the Faculty of Engineering at Cairo University. This is not a fringe discovery reported by independent researchers operating outside institutional channels. It is a peer-reviewed result produced by a multinational scientific team with the full cooperation of the Egyptian government. What remains unexplained is what the Big Void is, what it contains, and why it exists in a structure whose every other internal feature has been mapped and studied for 2 centuries. Now go back inside the pyramid to a discovery made almost exactly 24 years earlier. In 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink was contracted to improve the ventilation system inside the Queen's Chamber, one of the pyramid's interior rooms, using a small remote-controlled robot he had built himself. The robot, which he named Upuaut II, meaning opener of the ways in ancient Egyptian, was sent into a narrow shaft, approximately 8 inches square, that runs from the Queen's Chamber at an upward angle into the body of the pyramid. The shaft had been known since 1872, when British engineer Wayneman Dixon first explored it with a long wire. No one knew where it led. Upuaut II crawled up approximately 200 feet of that shaft before its camera revealed something that brought the project to an immediate halt. A small stone door, with 2 copper fittings that looked, in the robot's lights, like handles. The shaft did not vent to the outside of the pyramid. It ended at a sealed door, and on the other side of that door, no one knows what exists. A follow-up robot mission in 2002, authorized by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, drilled a small hole through the door and inserted a fiber optic camera. Behind the first door was a small space, and at the back of that space was another door. No one has been beyond the second door. Archaeologists have noted that the Queen's Chamber shafts do not serve any obvious ventilation function. They were sealed at both ends and would not have circulated air regardless. One theory suggests they were symbolic passageways intended to allow the pharaoh's soul to travel to specific star systems. The northern shaft pointing toward the constellation we call the Little Dipper, the southern shaft aligned with the Belt of Orion. This is the astronomical interpretation advanced by researcher Robert Bauval, beginning in 1994. And it has generated sustained and legitimate academic debate ever since. What remains unexplained is what the doors were protecting, why 2 of them exist in sequence, and why this passage architecture appears nowhere in the surviving textual record of Egyptian burial traditions. The third interior mystery operates at a different frequency, not visual, not structural, but acoustic. In the year 2000, British researcher John Stuart Reid, working with Egyptian archaeologist Abdel Hakim Awayan, conducted an acoustic survey inside the King's Chamber, the uppermost and most precisely constructed room in the pyramid, built from massive blocks of red Aswan granite. Using tone generators and measurement equipment, Reid documented that the King's Chamber produces a standing wave resonance at approximately 8 Hz when sound is introduced into the space. 8 Hz sits below the threshold of human hearing. You cannot hear it, but your body registers it. Frequencies in the range of 7 to 8 Hz correspond to what neurologists call the theta brainwave state, the boundary between waking consciousness and the earliest stage of sleep, associated with deep relaxation, heightened suggestibility, and in some documented contexts, altered states of awareness. One theory suggests this acoustic property was intentional, that the chamber was designed as a space for ritual practices involving sensory alteration, sound, and states of consciousness that do not translate easily into modern frameworks. This theory remains unverified and contested. No textual evidence from ancient Egypt explicitly describes the pyramid being used in this way. But the resonance is real. It has been measured, and the granite chamber's dimensions, its precise proportions, the specific mass of its ceiling beams, the reflective properties of polished granite produce this effect in a way that is not obviously accidental. Archaeologists have noted that the king's chamber's 8 granite ceiling beams, each weighing approximately 70 tons, are cracked, some of them deeply. The cracks are ancient. One theory suggests they resulted from a significant seismic event. Another suggests they were cracked during construction by thermal stress. What remains unexplained is why, with the beams in this damaged state, the chamber above, called the relieving chambers, was constructed with such extraordinary precision in a space no human was ever intended to enter or see. The accumulated weight of these 3 interior mysteries, the hidden void, the sealed doors, the acoustic resonance, does not point in any single direction. They do not add up neatly to a unified alternative theory. What they do is something more uncomfortable. They suggest that the Great Pyramid is more architecturally complex than the burial monument hypothesis fully accounts for. They suggest that whoever designed this structure understood things about stone, space, sound, and light that we have not yet fully reverse-engineered. And they leave open, not as speculation, but as a matter of documented, unresolved physical record, the possibility that we are still in the early chapters of understanding what this building actually was. The big void is still sealed, the doors in the Queen's chamber shaft are still closed, and somewhere above the Grand Gallery, in a space that no human being in recorded history has ever entered, something has been sitting undisturbed in the dark for 4,500 years, waiting with extraordinary patience for the next question. Here is the most destabilizing sentence in modern archaeology, not because it is speculative, not because it comes from an outsider challenging the establishment, but because it comes directly from the excavation data, confirmed by multiple independent laboratories, published in peer-reviewed journals, and accepted by the mainstream archaeological community worldwide. Ready? The site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey was built by hunter-gatherers approximately 11,600 years ago, roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the invention of the wheel, and nearly 6,000 years before the earliest known writing system appeared anywhere on Earth. And then, at some point after its construction, the people who built it carefully, methodically, every single enclosure, filled in, sealed, hidden beneath tons of rubble and soil, and then they walked away. To understand why this matters so much, you need to understand what the standard model of human civilizational development looked like before 1996. The model was clean and logical, and had been largely stable for decades. It went like this. First came agriculture, which allowed settled communities to form. Settled communities produced surplus food, which freed some people from farming. Those freed people became specialists, potters, weavers, administrators, priests. Social complexity eventually produced monumental architecture, temples, palaces, ceremonial structures. In this model, organized religion and monumental building are downstream products of agricultural civilization. They come after. They require the foundation of settled, food-secure society to exist. Göbekli Tepe does not fit this model. It precedes it by thousands of years. The people who built it were, by every material indicator available in the archaeological record, mobile hunter-gatherers. The earliest layers of the site show no evidence of domesticated grain or animals. They were not, in the conventional sense, civilized, and yet they organized a labor force capable of quarrying limestone pillars weighing up to 10 tons, transporting them to a hilltop site, shaping them with stone tools into T-shaped columns bearing intricately carved animal reliefs, and arranging them in precise, circular enclosures with a geometric consistency that implies careful pre-planning and accumulated architectural knowledge. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist from the German Archaeological Institute, who first recognized the true significance of the site in 1994 and led its excavation from 1996 until his death in 2014, spent the better part of 2 decades carefully documenting what he had found. His conclusion, stated plainly in multiple publications and interviews before his death, was that Göbekli Tepe required a fundamental revision of the standard civilizational timeline, not a tweak, a revision. Schmidt argued that the site inverted the conventional model entirely. It was not that civilization produced religion. It was that the organizational demands of building a large ceremonial site, feeding workers, coordinating labor, managing materials across a sustained construction project may have driven the development of agriculture and settled community life. Religion, in this reading, did not emerge from civilization. That argument has not been universally accepted, but it has not been dismissed either. It sits now in the active, contested center of a debate that touches every assumption we carry about what human beings are capable of and when they became capable of it. The physical site itself rewards close attention because the precision of what was built there is easy to underestimate from photographs. The T-shaped pillars that define Göbekli Tepe's enclosures are not rough-hewn posts. They are carefully shaped limestone columns, some of them standing up to 20 feet tall, carved from bedrock quarries located on the same hilltop. The carved reliefs on their surfaces, foxes, snakes, cranes, wild boar, vultures, scorpions, spiders, aurochs are executed with a naturalism and technical confidence that implies a mature artistic tradition, not an experimental beginning. Some of the largest central pillars in the enclosures bear carved arms on their sides and a belt and loincloth around their lower sections, suggesting they were intended as anthropomorphic beings rather than simply architectural supports. Leclerc, who took over the directorship of the excavation after Schmidt's death and continues the work for the German Archaeological Institute today, has documented that the site contains not one or two enclosures, but at least 20, of which only a small fraction have been fully excavated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest the hilltop contains an enormous amount of still-buried structure. The excavated area represents, by current estimates, perhaps 5 to 10% of the total site. Archaeologists have noted that the construction quality varies across the site in a way that suggests the earliest enclosures in the deepest layers are actually the most sophisticated. The oldest structures, Layer 3, show the largest and most precisely worked pillars, the most elaborate carvings, the most geometrically consistent enclosure layouts. The later layers, built on top, are somewhat less refined. This is the opposite of what we would expect from a developing tradition. Skills, in this case, appear to have declined over time rather than improved, which is itself an unexplained feature of the site that has not been satisfactorily resolved. Now comes the part that changes everything. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was not buried by erosion, by flood, by the slow accumulation of wind-blown sediment over centuries. The stratigraphy, the layered structure of the deposits filling the enclosures, is consistent with intentional, organized backfilling. The material used to fill the enclosures includes animal bones, flint tools, stone vessels, and carved stone fragments, packed in a way that suggests deliberate collection and deposition rather than random accumulation. Someone gathered material and filled these spaces in, deliberately, and then the site was sealed under a layer of soil and effectively disappeared from the surface record. What remains unexplained is why. This is not a small question. Building Göbekli Tepe required an organizational effort of staggering scale for its time. Feeding the workers alone, archaeological evidence of intensive hunting and butchering of large game animals has been found across the site, would have required a regional coordination system unlike anything else documented from this period. Thousands of hours of skilled stone-carving labor are embedded in those pillars. The site represented, by any measure, an enormous investment of human time, energy, and intention. And then the people who built it chose to erase it. One theory suggests the burial was a ritual act of closure, a deliberate sealing of sacred space at the end of a ceremonial cycle, analogous to the way some later cultures destroyed or buried ritual objects after their sacred function was considered complete. This interpretation has the advantage of being consistent with documented ritual practices from later periods of human history. Another theory suggests the burial was protective, that the enclosures were sealed to preserve them from damage, perhaps in anticipation of a long absence, perhaps in response to a threat or disruption that the archaeological record has not yet revealed. A third interpretation More unsettling and more difficult to evaluate is that the burial was an act of suppression, that whoever was responsible for closing the site did so not to honor it but to end it, to prevent its continued use, to sever a community from a place of power or belief that had become, for reasons we cannot reconstruct, something to be hidden rather than celebrated. We have no way, at present, to determine which of these is correct. We may never know. The people who made this decision left no written record. Their reasoning is buried with the stones. There is one more layer to this story that rarely receives the attention it deserves. The site was known to local people in the region for generations before archaeologists arrived. It appeared in a 1963 survey conducted jointly by the University of Chicago and the Istanbul University as an unremarkable scatter of flint and broken limestone on a hilltop. The survey noted it, classified it, moved on. It sat in the survey records for more than 30 years before Klaus Schmidt, reviewing the archive data in 1994, recognized something that the original surveyors had missed or underweighted. The questions this raises about what else might be sitting in archived survey data classified, documented, and effectively forgotten are not paranoid questions. They are professional ones. The German Archaeological Institute has raised them explicitly. The history of Göbekli Tepe's near miss with permanent obscurity is a documented argument for the importance of re-examining old records with new frameworks. What the 1963 survey could not have known is that the hill they were standing on was, beneath their feet, one of the most significant archaeological sites ever found. It looked, from the surface, like nothing. That is worth remembering every time we assume we have a complete picture of the ancient world. Klaus Schmidt died in July of 2014, in the middle of the excavation season, of a sudden cardiac event. He had spent nearly 20 years of his professional life at this site. In his final published interviews, he spoke about Göbekli Tepe with a quality of restrained astonishment that comes through clearly even in translation. He described it as a site that kept revealing new complexity. The deeper they went, not the diminishing returns of a well-understood site approaching its secrets, but the expanding surprise of something that seemed, the more carefully it was studied, to be larger and stranger and more deliberate than even he had initially understood. He did not live to see the discovery of Enclosure F, documented in 2021, with its unfinished pillars, suggesting the construction was interrupted and never resumed. He did not see the most recent ground-penetrating radar results, mapping the full extent of what lies beneath the surface of that hilltop in southeastern Turkey. The site that rewrote the beginning of human history is still, in the most literal sense, mostly underground, undisturbed, waiting, and by every indication from the excavated fraction we have managed to uncover, considerably more complex than anything we were prepared to find. There is a test that engineers and archaeologists have performed at Sacsayhuaman that sounds almost too simple to be meaningful. They try to slide a razor blade between the stones, not a thick tool, not a probe, a standard razor blade, roughly 0.5 millimeter in thickness. And at the primary joints of the outer walls, the places where two massive limestone blocks meet face to face, the blade does not fit. The contact between the stones is tighter than the blade is thin. Two surfaces, each weighing dozens of tons, cut and placed by human hands using pre-industrial tools, meet with a precision that a modern machinist would not be embarrassed by. That is not a metaphor. That is a documented, repeatable, physical observation that has been confirmed by researchers, engineers, and journalists visiting the site for decades. And it is, in some ways, the least mysterious thing about Sacsayhuaman. The site sits on a steep hillside above the city of Cusco in southern Peru, at an elevation of approximately 12,100 feet. From a distance, its most immediately striking feature is scale. The outer walls are constructed in 3 parallel terraced lines, the lowest and most massive of which contains the blocks most often cited in discussions of ancient construction. The largest single stone in the complex has been measured and estimated at approximately 125 tons. It stands roughly 28 feet tall. It is not cut from a local outcrop. It was quarried, shaped, and moved to this location from a source estimated at between 15 and 35 kilometers away, depending on which quarry the specific block originated from. Primary construction of the complex is attributed to the Inca Empire, with major building phases occurring under the reign of the Inca Pachacuti beginning around 1438 of the Common Era and continuing under subsequent rulers for several generations. The Spanish chronicler Pedro de Cieza de León, writing in 1553, described witnessing Inca construction methods firsthand and recorded the use of large labor drafts organized through the mitar system, a form of obligatory public service through which the Inca state mobilized workers from across its territory for large infrastructure projects. This is a legitimate and well-documented explanation for how the Inca built what they built. It was sophisticated. It allowed the Inca Empire to construct thousands of miles of road, hundreds of administrative centers, and agricultural terracing across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The organizational intelligence behind Inca construction should not be underestimated, and it frequently is. But the razor blade test does not yield its result because of organizational intelligence alone. It yields its result because of stone dressing technique, and the specific technique that produces joints of this quality in multi-ton limestone blocks, without mortar, without metal tools of the kind available in later periods, and with a consistency maintained across hundreds of individual stones in a single wall. That technique is what continues to generate serious, unresolved discussion among researchers. Archaeologists have noted that the Inca construction method relied on a process called trial fitting, repeatedly moving a stone slightly, checking its contact with neighboring stones, removing material from the high points, and repeating the process until the fit achieved the desired tightness. This is a plausible and documented approach. Experimental archaeology has confirmed it can produce high-quality joints in relatively soft stone. The complication at Sacsayhuaman is the geometry of the blocks themselves. Unlike the rectangular, flat-faced blocks used in most ancient construction worldwide, the stones of the outer walls at Sacsayhuaman are polygonal, irregular in shape, with multiple angled faces, each one fitting against a different neighboring stone at a different angle. Some individual blocks contact 5, 6, or 7 other stones simultaneously across different faces. Each of those contact surfaces must fit tightly against its corresponding surface on the adjacent block. The combinatorial complexity of fitting irregularly shaped multi-ton objects against multiple neighbors simultaneously, while achieving tight contact across all faces at once, is a significant engineering challenge, even to describe clearly, let alone to execute. Moving a block to improve its fit against one neighbor typically changes its relationship to every other neighbor simultaneously. The adjustment process, if it operated the way experimental archaeology suggests, would have involved an extraordinary number of iterative movements of extremely heavy objects. One theory suggests the Inca developed sophisticated ramp and lever systems that allowed fine positional adjustment of heavy blocks with a precision that modern researchers have underestimated. This is consistent with the general picture of Inca engineering capability and deserves serious consideration. What remains unexplained is the specific sequencing logic, the order in which irregularly shaped polygonal blocks would need to be placed to allow each subsequent block to be fitted and adjusted without disturbing blocks already seated. No complete operational model for this process, accounting for all of the heaviest polygonal blocks in the outer wall, has been published and peer-reviewed in a form that has achieved consensus. Now here is where the story deepens in a direction that mainstream coverage of Sacsayhuaman almost never follows. The outer walls of the complex, the ones containing the massive polygonal limestone blocks with their razor-tight joints, sit on top of something else. Beneath the Inca construction, at the base of the structure, and in certain exposed sections where later stonework has shifted or collapsed, there are stone courses that do not match the Inca style of construction. They are different in their stone dressing approach, different in the scale of individual blocks in some sections, and different in their geological composition in ways that suggest they were not part of the primary Inca building program. Peruvian archaeologist Rodolfo Bravo, who conducted detailed surveys of the site, documented these sub-Inca courses and noted the stylistic discontinuity between them and the confirmed Inca construction above. The researcher and writer Alfonsina Barrionuevo, drawing on both archaeological documentation and Andean oral historical traditions, argued that the lower courses represented construction from a period predating the Inca Empire possibly by centuries. This claim is controversial. It has not been confirmed by radiometric dating of the lower stones themselves, in part because limestone does not yield easily to the dating methods most commonly applied to organic material. The Peruvian Ministry of Culture, which controls excavation access at Sacsayhuaman, has not authorized the kind of deep stratigraphic investigation that would be required to definitively characterize the lower courses. That is a factual statement about access policy, not an accusation of concealment. Archaeological site management involves complex decisions about preservation, resource allocation, and research priority. But the practical effect is that a specific, documented question about the lower courses of Sacsayhuaman remains open, and the investigation required to close it has not been conducted. The Spanish chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, born in Cusco in 1539 to a Spanish conquistador father and an Inca princess mother, recorded in his 1609 work known in English as the Royal Commentaries of the Incas, something that tends to get buried in footnotes. He wrote that the Inca themselves, when asked about the massive stones of Sacsayhuaman, referred to them in oral tradition as the work of a people called Viracocha, a term that carried the meaning of a creator figure or an earlier race of beings who possessed capabilities the Inca did not claim for themselves. This is not evidence of anything beyond the existence of an oral tradition. Oral histories frequently attribute impressive construction to supernatural or ancestral figures, regardless of who actually built the structure. But it is a contemporaneous record of the Incas' own stated relationship to the site, and their stated relationship was one of inheritance rather than authorship, at least with respect to certain elements of the complex. What that means, if it means anything beyond the normal operation of myth-making, is a question that the physical evidence alone cannot answer. There is one more thing that Sacsayhuaman did that no amount of theoretical debate can explain away, because it happened in historical time and was witnessed and recorded. On March 31st, 1650, a major earthquake struck the city of Cusco. Contemporary accounts describe widespread destruction throughout the colonial city that the Spanish had built over and around the Inca structures since their conquest in 1533. Buildings collapsed, walls fell. The colonial cathedral on the main plaza was severely damaged. The walls of Sacsayhuaman, built without mortar, with irregularly shaped polygonal blocks simply resting against each other through the precision of their fit and their own weight, sustained the earthquake without significant structural failure. The Spanish buildings, constructed with mortar, with cut rectangular blocks, using the most advanced European construction techniques of the 16th century, did not perform as well as a wall built by people who, by the colonial framework, were considered primitive. Archaeologists have noted that the polygonal interlocking style used at Sacsayhuaman functions seismically in a way that is now understood. The blocks are able to shift slightly under seismic stress and then resettle, distributing force rather than concentrating it at mortar joints the way rigid bonded construction does. The Inca, in other words, had solved a structural engineering problem that European builders had not. Whether that solution was the product of accumulated empirical knowledge, of deliberate engineering insight, or of something inherited from an earlier tradition at this site, that question remains. As of this recording, genuinely open, the stones are still fitted. The blade still does not pass between them, and somewhere beneath the confirmed Inca construction, in the lower courses that have not been dated and have not been fully excavated, the oldest part of this structure is still waiting for someone to ask it the right question. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes with being wrong in public. Not personally wrong, institutionally wrong. Wrong in the way that textbooks are wrong, that university curricula are wrong, that the collectively agreed upon framework of an entire academic discipline turns out to have been built on assumptions that were never as solid as they appeared. That discomfort is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the thing that most honestly explains a pattern you see repeatedly in the history of archaeology. Not malice, not conspiracy, not a coordinated effort to hide inconvenient truths, but something more human and in some ways more interesting. This is not unique to archaeology. It happens in medicine. It happens in physics. It happens in every field where accumulated professional identity becomes entangled with specific theoretical positions. The philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn described the mechanics of it in 1962 in a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and everything he described maps cleanly onto what has happened repeatedly in our understanding of the ancient world. But here is what makes the archaeological case particularly worth examining. The revisions, when they have come, have not been small, and the pattern of how they arrived, slowly, against resistance, often vindicated only after the researchers who fought for them had spent years or decades professionally marginalized, tells us something important about what we should do with the questions that remain open right now. Begin with a case that is now settled, accepted, and quietly embarrassing for the institutions involved. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the prevailing view among American archaeologists and anthropologists was that the enormous earthen mounds scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi river valleys, some of them geometrically precise, some containing sophisticated artifacts, some aligned to astronomical events, could not have been built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples living in those regions at the time of European contact. The argument was not based on evidence. It was based on the assumption, rooted in the racial frameworks of 19th century scholarship, that the indigenous peoples of North America were incapable of the organizational complexity required to build monumental architecture. The mounds, in this view, required a more advanced builder. Various candidates were proposed over the decades: a lost white race, Phoenician sailors, refugees from Atlantis. The Smithsonian Institution, through its Bureau of Ethnology, played a central role in both propagating and eventually dismantling this myth. Roger Kennedy, who served as director of the National Museum of American History, documented this history in detail in his 1994 book, Hidden Cities. The Smithsonian has since acknowledged the institutional role it played in suppressing Native American authorship of the mounds. The mounds were built by Native Americans. The evidence for this was available, in some form, throughout the period when the institution was denying it. What prevented the correct conclusion from being reached was not a lack of data. It was a framework that could not accommodate the data correctly. This is a real, documented case of archaeological suppression. It did not involve extraterrestrials or secret societies. It involved racism, institutional inertia, and the very human tendency to interpret evidence in ways that confirm existing beliefs. Now move forward to a more recent case, one that is still actively unfolding and considerably more scientifically complex. In 2007, a team of researchers led by physicist Richard Firestone published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious peer-reviewed journals in the world, proposing what became known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The hypothesis argued that approximately 12,900 years ago, at the onset of a sudden and severe cold period called the Younger Dryas, a fragmented comet or asteroid impacted or airburst over the North American ice sheet, triggering catastrophic wildfires, rapid climate change, the extinction of North American megafauna including mammoths and mastodons, and the collapse of the Clovis culture, the earliest well-documented human culture in the Americas. The initial reception from the geological and archaeological establishment was skeptical, in some cases harshly so. Critics raised legitimate methodological concerns about the evidence, the presence of impact markers like nanodiamonds and spherules in sediment layers from the Younger Dryas boundary. Some attempted replications reported difficulty reproducing the findings, but the hypothesis did not collapse. It accumulated evidence. A 2018 study, published in the Journal of Geology, examining sediment cores from sites across 4 continents, found Younger Dryas boundary markers consistent with a large cosmic impact event. A 2023 analysis of sediment data from sites in 12 countries reached similar conclusions. The hypothesis remains contested. That is an honest characterization of the current state of the science, but it has moved from the fringes of credibility to the active center of a legitimate scientific debate. Researchers who published in support of it in 2007, when doing so carried professional risk, have been at least partially vindicated. What this case illustrates is not that every heterodox claim eventually proves correct. Most do not. What it illustrates is that the process of institutional science can be slow, resistant, and socially punishing in ways that have nothing to do with the quality of the underlying evidence, and that this dynamic has real consequences for what gets studied, what gets funded, and what gets taught. Mark Becker, a historian at Truman State University, whose work focuses on pre-Columbian and indigenous Latin American history, has written extensively about the systematic underestimation of pre-Columbian organizational and intellectual complexity in mainstream scholarship. His argument and it is an argument grounded in archival and archaeological evidence rather than speculation, is that the framework inherited from the colonial period, which positioned indigenous American civilizations as primitive relative to European contemporaries, has distorted archaeological interpretation in ways that are still being corrected. This matters for the sites we have been examining because the question of what pre-Columbian peoples were capable of is not merely academic. It determines what explanations archaeologists consider plausible when confronted with evidence that does not fit comfortable categories. When a stone joint is tighter than a razor blade at a site built by indigenous Andean people, the instinct, shaped by colonial frameworks, is to look for an external explanation, a lost civilization, a more advanced predecessor culture, a non-human intelligence. The more honest response, and the more scientifically productive one, is to take seriously the possibility that the people who built it were more capable than the inherited framework allows for, and to investigate that capability on its own terms. There is a concept that the archaeologists involved in these debates sometimes invoke with a kind of weary precision. They call it archaeological silence. Archaeological silence is what happens when a question is not unanswered but unasked. When a site is not excavated because the funding does not exist, or because the political situation in the host country makes collaboration difficult, or because the question the site might answer is not currently fashionable in the journals that determine career advancement. It is the gap in the record produced not by the absence of ancient evidence, but by the absence of modern inquiry. UNESCO's 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and the broader framework of international heritage law that has developed over the past half-century, has had the complicated effect of simultaneously protecting ancient sites from destruction and restricting the kind of invasive investigation that would answer the most pressing questions about them. This is a genuine tension, not a conspiracy. Preservation and investigation are sometimes competing values. The choice to preserve, rather than excavate, is often the correct one, but it means that specific questions about specific sites, the lower courses at Sacsayhuaman, the chambers behind the sealed doors in the Queen's chamber shaft, the unexcavated 90% of Göbekli Tepe remain open, not because anyone is hiding the answers, but because the answers have not yet been sought. What if we have been wrong? The honest answer is that we have been wrong before, in specific and documented ways, and that the corrections, when they came, required overcoming institutional resistance that had nothing to do with evidence, and everything to do with the social dynamics of how knowledge is produced and protected. That does not mean every alternative theory is correct. It does not mean the alien hypothesis deserves equal standing with peer-reviewed archaeology. It does not mean that institutional skepticism is always bad faith. It means that the questions we have been sitting with across the last several parts of this documentary, the unexplained precision, the impossible waits, the deliberate burials, the sealed doors deserve to be held with a specific kind of seriousness. Not the credulous seriousness that accepts any explanation, the rigorous seriousness that refuses to accept the absence of a good explanation as equivalent to the presence of one. The history of archaeology is not a story of steady, uninterrupted progress toward complete understanding. It is a story of long silences, sudden revisions, and the slow, difficult work of people willing to ask questions that the current framework cannot comfortably accommodate. We are still inside that story, and the next chapter has not been written yet. There is a moment in archaeology when the folk memory turns out to be literally true. Not metaphorically true, not symbolically true, literally, physically, demonstrably true in a way that makes everyone who dismissed it feel the particular embarrassment of having been more skeptical than the evidence warranted. That moment happened on Easter Island in 2012, and it changed, in a quiet but fundamental way, how researchers think about the relationship between indigenous oral tradition and archaeological interpretation. The story the Rapa Nui people had told for generations was simple. The statues walked, not metaphorically, in the sense of being spiritually animated or ritually significant, though they were those things too, walked, on their bases, upright, moved from the quarry to their platforms by being rocked and swayed in an upright position, guided by ropes, travelling across the landscape the way a heavy refrigerator moves when you tip it slightly and walk it across a floor. Archaeologists, for most of the 20th century, treated this as mythology, a story told to explain something the descendants of the builders no longer knew how to do. The statues were heavy. The average moai weighs around 13 tons, and some exceed 80, and the conventional assumption was that they had been laid horizontally on sledges or log rollers and dragged to their destinations. This assumption shaped decades of research and dozens of experimental attempts. Then Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo decided to take the oral tradition seriously. Hunt, an anthropologist at the University of Hawaii, and Lipo, an archaeologist now at Binghamton University, had spent years working on Easter Island and had become increasingly skeptical of the standard models, not because of any mystical inclination, but because the standard models did not fit the physical evidence on the ground. The roads leading from the Rano Raraku quarry to the coastal platforms were not wide enough for horizontal transport with the kind of sledge systems proposed. The sides of the roads showed erosion patterns more consistent with vertical rocking movement than with horizontal dragging. And the bases of the moai themselves are not flat, they are slightly curved in a way that is difficult to explain if the statues were designed to lie on their sides during transport, but makes immediate sense if they were designed to be rocked on their curved bases while upright. In 2012, Hunt and Lipo conducted an experiment. They built a replica moai, roughly 5 feet tall and weighing just under 5 tons, small by Easter Island standards, but heavy enough to be meaningful. They attached 3 ropes to it, 2 at the sides and 1 at the back. With a team of 18 people, using no machinery, no sledges, no logs, they walked the statue approximately 100 meters in under an hour. The statue moved exactly the way the oral tradition described. Rocking, swaying slightly, traveling upright, moving under its own geometry. Guided by rope, the results were published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. The experiment has been replicated. The walking hypothesis, once dismissed as mythology, is now the leading model for moai transport among researchers actively working at the site. What the Rapa Nui people remembered was true. It had been true all along, and the academic establishment spent the better part of a century not believing them. Easter Island, known in the Rapa Nui language as Te Pito o Te Henua, meaning the navel of the world, sits in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, approximately 2,300 miles off the coast of Chile and 2,500 miles from the nearest inhabited island. It is one of the most remote permanently inhabited places on Earth. Its population today is roughly 8,000 people. At its peak, before European contact in 1722 and the subsequent catastrophic demographic collapse from disease and slave raiding, the indigenous Rapa Nui population may have reached 15 to 20,000. The 887 moai known to exist were carved almost entirely from compressed volcanic ash called tuff, quarried from the inner slope of the Rano Raraku volcano. The quarry itself contains approximately 400 unfinished statues in various stages of completion. Some barely begun, some fully carved but never removed from the rock face, still attached at the spine to the bedrock as if the carvers walked away in the middle of a working day and never returned. One theory suggests this mid-task abandonment was triggered by the ecological collapse of the island, the gradual deforestation caused by both human activity and the introduction of the Polynesian rat, which consumed tree seeds and prevented forest regeneration. As the trees disappeared, the resources required to transport and erect new statues became unavailable. The quarry was simply left as it was. Archaeologists have noted that this explanation is consistent with the paleoecological record, which shows a dramatic reduction in pollen from native tree species, coinciding roughly with the period of apparent construction cessation. The ecological collapse theory, developed in detail by researchers including Paul Barn and John Flenley, has been influential and broadly accepted in its outlines, though some of its specific mechanisms remain debated. But the statues in the quarry are not the most unexplained thing at Easter Island. The most unexplained thing at Easter Island has bodies. For most of the 20th century, the moai were understood as heads. This was a reasonable interpretation given what was visible: the great stone faces rising from the ground across the island's landscape, seemingly emerging from the earth from the shoulders up. What was not widely known, and what the general public still largely does not know, is that the vast majority of moai have full torsos, complete with arms, hands, and detailed surface carving buried beneath the ground surface. The Easter Island Statue Project, led by archaeologist Joanne van Tilburg of the University of California, Los Angeles, has been excavating selected moai since the 1990s. In 2012, the project completed excavations on 2 statues in the Rano Raraku quarry area that revealed torsos extending approximately 30 feet below the current ground surface. The result of centuries of sediment accumulation around statues that were always full-bodied. The excavations revealed something that deepens the mystery considerably. The buried surfaces of the torsos are covered in petroglyphs, carved symbols and geometric designs that are not visible on the above-ground portions of the statues. These carvings were made on surfaces that were either buried at the time of carving or buried shortly thereafter. In either case, they were made with the knowledge that they would not be seen. What remains unexplained is why. If the petroglyphs were intended to be seen as decoration, as identity markers, as religious symbols, carving them on surfaces that would be underground makes no functional sense by any interpretive framework based on display or communication. One theory suggests the carvings were intended not for human eyes, but for the earth itself, that the statues were conceived as connections between the sky, represented by the visible face, and the ground, represented by the carved and buried torso. In this interpretation, the moai were not monuments in the conventional sense, but physical anchors, linking the world above the surface to the world beneath it. This interpretation is speculative. Van Tilburg's team has been careful to present the finding without overreaching the evidence. But the petroglyphs are real, they are documented, they are photographed and published, and no explanation for their placement has yet achieved consensus. There is one more piece of this story that belongs in any honest account of Easter Island, and it involves a different kind of archaeology entirely. For decades, the question of where the Rapa Nui people came from was entangled with a theory proposed by Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl, who sailed a balsa wood raft called the Kon-Tiki from South America to Polynesia in 1947 to demonstrate that pre-Columbian South Americans could have settled the Pacific Islands. Heyerdahl's voyage was a genuine feat of seamanship and courage. His underlying hypothesis that Easter Island was settled from South America, rather than from Western Polynesia, was, for a long time, a serious point of debate. In 2020, a large-scale genomic study led by Alexander Ioannidis and published in the journal Nature resolved the settlement question with the clarity that only ancient DNA evidence can provide. The Rapa Nui people are Polynesian in origin, descended from populations who migrated eastward across the Pacific from the Western Islands. The DNA, however, also revealed something unexpected and genuinely remarkable evidence of genetic admixture with a native South American population, dating to approximately 800 of the Common Era, roughly 4 to 5 centuries before European contact. The implication is significant. The Rapa Nui did not come from South America, but at some point, before any European was aware either population existed, someone from the South American continent and someone from Polynesia met, interacted, and had children together. Whether this contact occurred on Easter Island itself, on the South American coast, or somewhere in between, is not yet established. Archaeologists have noted that this finding is consistent with the sweet potato, a South American domesticated crop being present in Polynesia centuries before European contact, a long-standing botanical puzzle that the genomic data helps explain. The Rapa Nui were not passive inhabitants of an isolated island. They were participants in a Pacific world far more connected, far more navigated, and far more actively explored than the history books suggested when most of us were in school. The statues walked. The bodies have carvings no one was meant to see. The people who built them were sailors and navigators, whose reach across the ocean we are still measuring. Every answer on this island opens onto a longer question, and somewhere in the unexcavated ground, around 390-odd statues still partially buried in the Rano Raraku quarry, in the sediment layers that have not yet been carefully removed, there are petroglyphs on buried stone surfaces that no living human being has seen. They have been there, undisturbed, for somewhere between 500 and 800 years, waiting with the patience that only stone possesses for the next careful pair of hands. There is a number that tends to stop people mid-sentence when they first encounter it. 1,650 tons, not pounds. The weight of a single worked stone block, still lying in its ancient quarry outside the city of Baalbek in modern Lebanon. carved on its lower face with a precision that indicates deliberate human intention, never moved, never placed, never incorporated into any structure, just sitting there, in the ground, where it has been for somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years. For context, the single heaviest object ever moved by human beings using modern heavy lift technology, an offshore oil platform base moved in Norway in 1991, weighed approximately 40,000 tons, but it was moved floating in water, using the buoyancy of the ocean to negate most of its effective weight. The heaviest object ever moved on land using wheeled transport weighed around 15,000 tons and required specially engineered multi-axle hydraulic platforms, purpose-built roads, and months of preparation. The stone of the south at Baalbek weighs 1,650 tons. It is a single piece of limestone. It was cut by hand, and no one has produced a physically verified, experimentally tested method for moving it using any technology plausibly available in the ancient world. That is not a fringe position. That is the current state of the engineering literature on this specific object. Baalbek sits in the Bekaa Valley of eastern Lebanon, approximately 80 kilometers northeast of Beirut, at an elevation of roughly 1,170 meters above sea level. The site has been continuously inhabited and religiously significant for at least 9,000 years, with evidence of Bronze Age settlement dating to approximately 9,000 BCE. By the time the Romans arrived in the 1st century before the Common Era, Baalbek, which they renamed Heliopolis, the city of the sun, was already an ancient place of worship, layered with the accumulated religious significance of cultures that preceded Roman civilization by millennia. The Romans built magnificently here. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek was, at its completion, the largest Roman temple ever constructed, larger than the Parthenon, larger than any temple in Rome itself. The Temple of Bacchus, still standing to a remarkable degree of completeness, is considered by many architectural historians to be the best preserved Roman temple in the world. The engineering of the Roman construction at Baalbek represents the imperial period at the height of its technical capability, and the Romans built all of it on top of a foundation they did not make and, by the surviving record, did not fully understand. The trilithon is the name given to 3 enormous limestone blocks incorporated into the western retaining wall of the main temple platform. Each block measures approximately 19 meters in length, 4 meters in height, and 3 to 4 meters in depth. They are placed in a single course, one after another, at a height of approximately 7 meters above the ground, meaning they are not at the base of the structure, but elevated, sitting on top of smaller blocks below them. The Roman construction above and around the trilithon is clearly Roman in style, material, and execution. The trilithon itself is not. The limestone used, the tooling marks on the exposed surfaces, the scale of the individual blocks, all of these differ from the confirmed Roman stonework in ways that multiple researchers have documented. The Romans, in constructing their temple platform, incorporated these 3 pre-existing stones into their foundation, rather than replacing them. They built around them, over them, and against them. This implies that when Roman engineers arrived at Baalbek and began constructing the Jupiter temple complex, the trilithon was already there, already placed, already elevated to a height that itself represents a significant engineering challenge, since lifting 800-ton blocks to a height of 7 meters is a task that strains the limits of any reconstructed ancient lifting system. The Romans left no written record describing the trilithon or its origins. Their silence on the subject of the most anomalous feature of their own construction project is itself a kind of data point. Though what it means is not clear, they may have considered the older stones simply a fortunate pre-existing foundation. They may have had oral knowledge of their origin that was never committed to text. Or they may have been, as researchers working at the site today sometimes quietly suggest, as puzzled by the stones as we are. In 2014, an excavation conducted by the German Archaeological Institute under the direction of Janine Abdul-Masih and Jörg Yasmin, working in the ancient limestone quarry, located approximately 800 meters south of the main temple complex, uncovered a stone that changed the parameters of the entire discussion. The Stone of the South, as it has come to be called, was found still lying in the quarry, partially exposed, its upper surface visible but its full dimensions previously unmeasured. The 2014 excavation revealed its complete size for the first time. At approximately 19.6 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 5.5 meters deep, it is estimated to weigh between 1,600 and 1,650 tons, making it the largest known worked stone in human history. It was never moved. The quarrying process appears to have been completed. The stone is separated from the bedrock on its upper and side faces, but the undercutting necessary to fully free it from the ground below was either never finished or was abandoned. Partway through, there are tool marks on its surfaces. There is clear evidence of deliberate, organized quarrying activity. And then, at some point, the work stopped. We do not know why. The German Archaeological Institute published the findings in peer-reviewed form. The discovery was covered by major international media outlets. It is not a contested finding. The stone of the south is real. It is documented. It is the largest shaped stone ever recorded, and it is sitting in the same quarry where it was cut, having never travelled anywhere. The question of transportation is where the engineering discussion becomes genuinely unresolved. For the trilithon, blocks 800 tons each, several transport hypotheses have been proposed and partially evaluated. The most detailed experimental archaeology on this question was conducted by a team from the German Archaeological Institute in collaboration with engineers from several European universities in the early 2000s. Their work focused on the use of large wooden sledge systems, rock-cut transport roads, and organized teams of workers using rope and lever systems to move stone blocks of significant but sub-trilithon mass. The results were instructive but not conclusive. The experimental team demonstrated that blocks weighing up to approximately 100 tons could be moved with reasonable efficiency using plausible ancient technology. Scaling those methods to 800 tons introduces mechanical challenges that are not simply linear extensions of the smaller scale demonstrations. Rope systems that work at 100 tons fail catastrophically at 800. Wooden sledge components that bear 100 tons flex and fracture under 8. The engineering problems at trilithon scale are qualitatively different from those at the experimentally tested scale, not merely quantitatively larger. One theory suggests that a system of wooden beams arranged in a large square frame around the stone, allowing it to be rolled rather than slid, could theoretically move an 800-ton block with a sufficiently large workforce. This proposal has been analysed on paper by several engineering teams. It has not been physically replicated at anything approaching trilithon scale. What remains unexplained is not the theoretical possibility of moving these stones. With enough workers, enough time, and the right system, very large objects can be moved by pre-industrial means. What remains unexplained is the specific operational sequence, how you load an 800-ton block onto a transport system, move it across terrain that includes grade changes and irregular ground, and then elevate it to a height of 7 meters and position it with the precision observed in the trilithon, using only technology that can be confirmed present in the ancient Levant at the relevant period. No published paper has provided a complete answer to all parts of that question simultaneously. The lower platform at Baalbek, the structure of which the trilithon is a part, contains not only these 3 massive blocks but a fourth, somewhat smaller stone in the same course. And below the trilithon course, a series of blocks each weighing between 300 and 500 tons. The entire lower platform represents an investment of stoneworking and transport effort at a scale that has no clear parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. And it predates the Roman construction above it. By how much is the question that cannot currently be answered. No organic material has been found in direct, unambiguous stratigraphic contact with the lower platform stones. In a context that would allow radiocarbon dating, the stones themselves are limestone, which does not yield to the most commonly applied dating methods. The 2014 excavation by the German Archaeological Institute was explicit about this limitation. In its published findings, the lower platform cannot currently be dated by any available physical method applied to the stones themselves. This means the lower platform at Baalbek is simultaneously one of the most physically impressive ancient constructions ever documented and one of the least temporally understood. We know what it is. We know where it is. We do not know when it was built, by whom, or using what methods. Janine Abdul-Masih, whose excavation work at the site has been among the most rigorous conducted there in recent decades, has been careful in her published statements to distinguish between what the evidence supports and what it invites. The evidence supports the existence of a pre-Roman monumental construction of extraordinary scale. It invites the question of cultural and technological origin. It does not, by itself, answer that question. There is something worth sitting with in the image of the Stone of the South. It is the largest thing any human being has ever deliberately shaped. Somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago, we cannot be more precise than that a group of people stood in a quarry in what is now Lebanon, looked at a mass of limestone bedrock and decided to cut a block of this size. They had a destination in mind. They had, presumably, some method for moving it once it was free, and then they stopped. The stone is still there, still in the quarry, still bearing the tool marks of the people who cut it. The unfinished undercut that would have freed it from the ground is still visible, still open, the work suspended at whatever moment the decision was made to walk away. We do not know if that decision was made in a single day or over a generation. We do not know if it was made willingly or under some form of compulsion, social, political, catastrophic. We do not know what they intended to build with it or where they intended it to go. What we know is that someone, at some point in the ancient past, possessed the organizational capacity, the technical knowledge, and the sheer collective will to cut the largest stone ever shaped by human hands. And then they left it behind, in the ground, where it has been waiting, with extraordinary and unanswered patience, ever since. Most people think the story of Stonehenge has been told. It has not. The version most of us know, the circular arrangement of massive standing stones on Salisbury Plain, built by ancient Britons, aligned to the summer solstice sunrise, purpose unknown, is accurate as far as it goes, but it stops at the surface, literally and figuratively. And in the last decade, the ground beneath and around Stonehenge has been revealing a landscape so much larger, so much more deliberately organized, and so much more acoustically intentional than the visible monument, suggests that researchers working on the site have described the experience of processing the new data as something close to starting over. What we thought we knew about Stonehenge was the outline of a story whose full text we had not yet found. And the full text, it is becoming increasingly clear, is stranger and more beautiful than the outline suggested. Begin with the discovery that almost no one outside specialist circles has fully absorbed. In September of 2015, a team from the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, a collaboration between the University of Bradford, the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Archaeological Prospection in Vienna, and several partner institutions, announced the results of a 4-year ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry survey of the landscape surrounding Stonehenge. The survey covered an area of approximately 12 square kilometers around the visible monument, mapping subsurface features to a depth of 3 meters without any excavation. What they found buried beneath a low ridge called Durrington Walls, approximately 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge, was the outline of a monument that dwarfs the one the world knows. Durrington Walls had been known since the early 20th century as a large Neolithic henge, a circular earthwork enclosure. What the 2015 survey revealed was that the earthwork enclosed, beneath its surface, the stumps of approximately 90 massive stone pillars, each estimated to have stood between 1 and 4.5 meters tall, arranged in a continuous line approximately 900 meters in diameter. The structure, when it stood, would have been the largest stone monument in Britain, possibly in Europe. It has been there, completely invisible, buried under the turf of Salisbury Plain, for 4,500 years. The lead researcher on the project, Vince Gaffney of the University of Bradford, described the finding in a press conference as representing a complete rewriting of our understanding of the Stonehenge landscape. That description was not hyperbole. The implications of a monument of this scale existing in direct proximity to Stonehenge, built by the same culture, in the same period, using comparable organizational resources, transform the visible stone circle from a singular anomaly into one node in a far larger ceremonial complex, whose full extent is still being mapped. Archaeologists have noted that the Durrington Walls superhenge appears to have been deliberately dismantled before its enclosing earthwork was constructed, meaning the stones were removed and the earthwork built over the remaining stumps, effectively sealing the monument beneath a new layer of landscape modification. Why a community would build a monument of this scale and then bury it is a question that connects directly to the deliberate burial at Göbekli Tepe we examined earlier, and for which, similarly, no consensus answer currently exists. Now go inside Stonehenge itself and listen. In 2012, Rupert Till, an archaeoacoustician at the University of Huddersfield, published research that had been developing for several years in collaboration with Bruno Fazenda, using a combination of physical acoustic measurements taken at the site and a detailed computer model built from precise survey data of the stone arrangement in its original, more complete configuration. Till and his team calculated what Stonehenge would have sounded like when it was intact, when all the standing stones and lintels were in place, and the circle was complete. The results were striking enough to generate sustained coverage in the scientific press, and cautious enough in their claims to survive that coverage with their credibility intact. The original Stonehenge, according to the acoustic model, would have produced a reverberation time of approximately 1 second when sound was generated inside the circle. 1 second of reverberation is the acoustic signature of a small stone chapel, a space that makes the human voice and simple musical instruments sound rich, enveloping, and somehow larger than their source. It is the reverberation time that choral traditions across the world have historically found most conducive to communal singing and ritual vocalization. 1 second is also, not coincidentally, roughly the reverberation time of the decorated Neolithic chambers at sites like Newgrange in Ireland and the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta, where acoustic properties have been independently measured and documented. The pattern of deliberately constructed resonant spaces in Neolithic Britain and Europe is not, at this point, a single anomalous data point. It is beginning to look like a recurring design feature. Till was careful in his published statements to avoid overclaiming. The acoustic properties of Stonehenge are consistent with intentional acoustic design, but consistency is not proof of intention. The same reverberation time might be produced accidentally by a circular arrangement of stones built for entirely different reasons. What the research establishes is that the acoustic effect is real and measurable, that it would have been experienced by anyone using the monument for ritual or ceremonial purposes, and that similar effects appear to have been deliberately created at other Neolithic sites. What remains unexplained is whether this was design or coincidence. And that question, honest as it is, should not cause us to underweight the finding. At some point, when enough Neolithic enclosed spaces turn out to have the same resonant acoustic properties, the null hypothesis of coincidence requires more defense than the hypothesis of intention. The bluestone question is perhaps the most recently clarified major mystery at Stonehenge, and its resolution has produced a new mystery in place of the old one. The bluestones, the smaller inner circle of stones at Stonehenge, averaging around 2 to 5 tons each, visually distinct from the massive sarsen sandstone blocks of the outer ring, have been known since the early 20th century to originate in Wales, approximately 240 kilometres from Salisbury Plain. The geological source was identified broadly as the Preseli Hills of Pembrokeshire, but the specific quarry location within those hills remained uncertain for decades. In 2019, a team led by Mike Parker-Pearson of University College London, working with geologist Richard Bevins and petrographer Rob Ixer, published findings in the journal Antiquity that pinpointed the primary source of the bluestones to 2 specific outcrops in the Preseli Hills, Carn Godog and Craig Rossi Felin. The identification was made through precise geochemical matching of the Stonehenge stones against samples from the Welsh outcrops. The paper contained a finding that generated immediate and widespread attention among Stonehenge researchers. The quarrying activity at Carn Godog and Craig Rossi Felin was dated by radiocarbon analysis of organic material found in the quarry contexts to approximately 3400 BCE, roughly 5400 years ago. Stonehenge, in its current stone phase, was not begun until approximately 3000 BCE, roughly 500 years after the bluestones were quarried. This means the bluestones were cut from their Welsh outcrops, moved from Wales, and stood somewhere assembled into some structure, serving some purpose for approximately 4 to 5 centuries before they were incorporated into Stonehenge. They were not quarried for Stonehenge. They came to Stonehenge from somewhere else, carrying with them the accumulated significance of wherever they had previously stood. Parker-Pearson's team has proposed, based on the available evidence, that the blue stones may have originally stood at a monument in Wales, possibly a dismantled stone circle in the Preseli Hills, before being transported to Salisbury Plain as part of a process of cultural consolidation or ancestral monument relocation. This is a well-reasoned hypothesis, grounded in the dating evidence, and in comparative examples of stone monument reuse from other Neolithic contexts in Britain. What remains unexplained is where, precisely, the blue stones stood during those intervening 4 to 5 centuries. No candidate monument in Wales has been definitively identified as their intermediate home. The stones travelled 240 kilometres, assembled somewhere, served whatever purpose they served for nearly half a millennium, and then travelled again to become part of the structure we know. Their journey, its route, its organisation, its meaning to the people who undertook it, is one of the more quietly astonishing open questions in British prehistory. The sarsen stones of the Outer Ring present a separate and equally unresolved question of transport and placement. Each sarsen upright weighs approximately 25 tons. The sarsen lintels that cap them, curved to follow the circle's geometry on their inner and outer faces, weigh approximately 7 tons each. The source of the sarsen stone was confirmed in 2020 by a geochemical analysis led by David Nash of the University of Brighton. The stones came from West Woods in Wiltshire, approximately 25 kilometres north of Stonehenge. 25 kilometres is considerably more manageable than 240. But moving 25-ton stones across 25 kilometres of rolling chalk downland and then raising them to sufficient height to position 7-ton lintels on top of them, with the precision required for the curved geometry of the lintel ring, this remains an engineering problem without a fully demonstrated solution. Archaeologists have noted that the lintel stones were shaped with a slight upward curve on their undersides to compensate for the visual distortion that would otherwise make horizontal elements appear to sag at their centres, a technique called entasis, more commonly associated with classical Greek architecture and the Parthenon. Its presence at Stonehenge, in a monument built roughly 1500 years before the Parthenon, suggests a level of geometric and perceptual sophistication that popular accounts of Neolithic builders rarely communicate. There is something about Stonehenge that becomes more, rather than less, mysterious the more carefully it is studied. The hidden twin beneath Durrington walls, the acoustic chamber that would have surrounded anyone standing inside the complete circle with a second of rich, enveloping resonance. The blue stones that arrived carrying centuries of prior history, the lintels curved to compensate for human visual perception, the landscape beneath the surface still being mapped, still yielding new structures, still showing the outline of a ceremonial world far larger than the visible monument ever suggested. Most ancient sites, when studied carefully enough, begin to feel smaller. The mysteries narrow, the explanations arrive. The human scale of the achievement becomes clear and comprehensible. Stonehenge moves in the opposite direction. Every new survey, every new analysis, every new measurement of the ground beneath the plain reveals more deliberate organization, more accumulated intention, more evidence of a sustained and sophisticated relationship between a culture and a landscape that we are, in the most literal sense, still uncovering. The stones have been standing on Salisbury Plain for 4,500 years. They have been waiting, patient and largely silent, for instruments sensitive enough to hear what they were always saying. We are only now beginning to listen. Something happens when you step back far enough from the individual sites. Not a conclusion, not a proof, something more like a persistent visual pattern that appears when you reduce the resolution of the map the way a coastline looks random when you are standing on the beach, but reveals a coherent shape when you see it from altitude. 7 sites, 7 separate cultures, 7 independent construction traditions separated by thousands of miles and, in some cases, thousands of years. And yet, when you lay certain properties of these sites against each other, their astronomical orientations, their geographic distribution, their construction priorities, a set of overlaps appears that is either one of the most meaningful patterns in the archaeological record or one of the most seductive examples of the human brain finding signal in noise. The honest position is that we do not yet know which one it is. What we can do is examine the overlaps themselves, identify which ones are real and documented and which ones are artifacts of selection and interpretation, and sit with the genuine uncertainty that remains when that sorting is done carefully. Start with the astronomical orientations, because this is the area where the evidence is strongest and the documentation most rigorous. The Great Pyramid of Giza is oriented to true north, with a deviation of less than 1/15 of a single degree, a precision that, as surveyor Kate Spence argued in a paper published in Nature in 2000, is consistent with the ancient Egyptians having used the simultaneous transit of two circumpolar stars, Mizar and Kochab, to establish true north during the construction period around 2500 BCE. This is a specific, testable, archaeoastronomically grounded explanation for a documented precision. It does not require exotic technology or lost knowledge. It requires careful observation of the night sky over an extended period. Stonehenge is oriented to the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset along its primary axis, confirmed by survey and consistently documented across multiple independent studies. The alignment is precise enough that it must be intentional. The midwinter sunset alignment, which directs light down the avenue toward the monument's center, is now considered by many researchers to be the primary ceremonial orientation, with the midsummer sunrise perhaps serving as its reciprocal. The Maya site of Chichen Itza in Mexico contains the pyramid known as El Castillo, oriented such that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the angle of afternoon sunlight creates a shadow pattern on the northern staircase that resembles a descending serpent, the feathered serpent deity Kukulkan. This effect has been confirmed by observation and documented extensively. It is intentional by any reasonable assessment. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is oriented to the west, unusual for a Hindu temple, which conventionally faces east in a way that archaeoastronomer Eleanor Manika documented in her 1996 study as encoding a series of astronomical measurements into the temple's architectural proportions and axial alignments. Her analysis remains debated in its specifics, but has not been refuted in its broad finding that astronomical knowledge was deliberately encoded in the structure. Archaeologists have noted that astronomical orientation in monumental architecture is a near-universal feature of ancient ceremonial construction worldwide. The sun rises and sets. The solstices and equinoxes mark the turning of the agricultural and seasonal year. Orienting a significant structure toward these events is a human behavior so widespread and so functionally explicable that its presence at multiple sites is not, by itself, evidence of any connection between those sites. It is evidence of human universals, the shared tendency of organized societies to mark celestial cycles in their most permanent constructions. This is the calibration that honest analysis requires. The astronomical alignments are real. Their convergence across sites is not mysterious in itself. What is worth examining more carefully is whether the specific precision of those alignments and the specific astronomical knowledge they imply is consistent with independent development at each site, or suggests something more. The geographic distribution question is more complicated and more contested. The observation that several major ancient sites cluster near the 30th parallel north, the line of latitude approximately 30 degrees above the equator, is factually accurate. Giza sits at 29 degrees 58 minutes north. Persepolis in Iran sits at 29 degrees 56 minutes north. Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, one of the great cities of the ancient Indus Valley civilization, sits at 27 degrees 19 minutes north. The discrepancy between these figures and the round number of 30 degrees is significant enough that the clustering, while real, requires careful statistical evaluation rather than casual pattern matching. Ivan Sanderson, a naturalist and writer, proposed a geometric grid theory in 1972, suggesting that ancient sites worldwide cluster at specific nodes of a planetary geometric pattern. This hypothesis has not received peer-reviewed support and has not survived rigorous statistical testing. The distribution of ancient sites correlates more strongly with the distribution of ancient agricultural civilizations, which themselves cluster in the temperate and subtropical zones where reliable growing seasons exist, than with any proposed geometric grid. This is worth stating clearly because the grid hypothesis is widely circulated in popular media as though it carries evidentiary weight that it does not. The honest position is that the geographic clustering of ancient sites near certain latitudes reflects agricultural geography more than any hidden organizational principle. What remains unexplained, and what is genuinely worth holding as an open question, is the specific precision of the 30th parallel coincidence at Giza, where the pyramid sits within 2 minutes of arc of exactly 30 degrees north. Whether this reflects intentional site selection a cosmological significance attached to this latitude by ancient Egyptian astronomers, or simple coincidence, is not currently resolved. The more substantive convergence question involves the Younger Dryas catastrophism hypothesis and its relationship to what appears to be a global construction impulse in the millennia following the end of the last ice age. Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 9600 BCE, roughly 3,000 years after the Younger Dryas cold period ended, and the climate of the post-glacial world stabilized. The earliest phases of monumental construction in Egypt, the Levant, the Indus Valley, and Mesoamerica all cluster in the period between approximately 10,000 and 3000 BCE, a window that corresponds to the warming, stabilizing, and eventual agricultural consolidation of the post-glacial world. One theory suggests, and this is Graham Hancock's central argument in his popular writing, most recently developed in his 2019 book America. Before that, a more advanced civilization existed before the Younger Dryas impact event, approximately 12,900 years ago, that this civilization was largely destroyed by the catastrophe, and that the monumental construction we observe in the subsequent millennia represents either survivors of that civilization transmitting preserved knowledge, or the gradual reconstruction of lost capabilities by post-catastrophe populations. This theory is not peer-reviewed. It has not been published in the journals where the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis itself, which is distinct from Hancock's cultural claims, has been evaluated. Ed Krupp, director of Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles and one of the foremost archaeoastronomers in the United States, has published specific and detailed critiques of the astronomical claims Hancock makes in support of his hypothesis, including a 1997 paper in Sky and Telescope that identified significant methodological problems with Robert Bauval's Orion correlation theory, on which part of Hancock's argument rests. The distinction between these two things, the peer-reviewed Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which has genuine and growing evidentiary support, and Hancock's cultural survival hypothesis, which does not, is critically important and frequently collapsed in popular media. What the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis does establish, if its findings hold under continued scrutiny, is that a major cosmic event disrupted human civilization globally approximately 12,900 years ago. What it does not establish is what civilizations existed before that event, what they knew, or whether any knowledge survived it. Those questions remain, as of this recording, genuinely open and genuinely unanswered by the available evidence. There is a more grounded convergence worth examining that tends to get less attention than the dramatic theories. Across Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, and several Mesoamerican sites, researchers have documented what appears to be a shared architectural grammar of circular or semicircular enclosures, oriented to celestial events, built at significant effort on prominent high ground, and associated with evidence of large-scale communal gathering and feasting. The specific cultural content of these sites differs enormously, but the functional template, a circular sacred space on elevated terrain, oriented to the sky, surrounded by evidence of communal ritual activity, appears across cultures that had no documented contact with each other. Archaeologists have noted that this convergence is consistent with human cognitive universals. The tendency across cultures to organize sacred space in ways that reflect the geometry of the horizon, the movement of celestial bodies, and the social dynamics of communal gathering. The circle is the natural shape of a group of people standing together and looking inward. The solstice is the natural celestial event most dramatically marked by the behavior of light on landscape. The elevated site is the natural choice for a place meant to be seen from a distance and to offer a view of the surrounding world. In other words, the convergence may reflect not contact between ancient cultures, but the shared architecture of human consciousness. The common, cognitive, and social tendencies that produce similar solutions to similar problems across in the populations. This explanation is less dramatic than the lost civilization theory. It is also, by the available evidence, more defensible. And it is, in its own way, more interesting because it suggests that the pattern we are seeing in the stones is not a message from a lost predecessor, but a reflection of something persistent and universal in what human beings are. The question of convergence, global pattern, or coincidence may not have a single answer. Some of the overlaps are coincidental, produced by selection bias and the human hunger for pattern. Some are the result of shared human universals, independent solutions to the same fundamental problems of time, space, and meaning. And some, a smaller number, more carefully bounded, remain genuinely unexplained by either of those frameworks, sitting at the intersection of documented precision and unresolved origin in a way that honest inquiry has not yet dissolved. The pattern is real enough to take seriously. It is not yet clear enough to explain. And that gap between the reality of the pattern and the inadequacy of our current explanations for it is exactly where the most interesting work in ancient history is happening right now. Let's be precise about something before we go any further. The word cover-up gets used in discussions of ancient history with a looseness that does real damage to the conversation. It collapses two completely different phenomena into a single dramatic category, and in doing so, it makes both phenomena harder to think about clearly. The first phenomenon is active suppression, the deliberate, coordinated concealment of specific evidence by specific people with the specific intention of preventing that evidence from reaching the public. This is what the word cover-up implies in its most common usage. It requires intent, coordination, and ongoing effort to maintain. The second phenomenon is institutional silence, the systemic failure of academic and governmental structures to ask certain questions, fund certain investigations, or revise certain frameworks, not because anyone has decided to hide something, but because the internal logic of those institutions makes certain kinds of inquiry professionally unrewarding, financially unsupported, or ideologically inconvenient. These are not the same thing. They produce different evidence trails, they require different responses, and they have different moral weights. Conflating them, treating institutional silence as proof of active suppression, is one of the primary ways that legitimate grievances about how knowledge is produced get redirected into conspiracy frameworks that ultimately serve no one's understanding. What this part of the documentary is going to do is examine both phenomena separately and honestly, using documented cases rather than inference. Begin with the clearest and most thoroughly documented example of genuine institutional suppression in the history of American archaeology. For most of the 19th century, the earthen mounds of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, enormous geometric earthworks, burial mounds, and effigy mounds representing some of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian construction in North America, were attributed by mainstream American archaeology not to the ancestors of the Native American peoples living in the region, but to a hypothetical lost race. This race was variously described as Phoenician sailors, Viking explorers, refugees from a sunken continent, or a vanished civilization of European origin that had been destroyed by the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans before European contact. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, established in 1879 under the direction of John Wesley Powell, played a central and well-documented role in both the propagation and the eventual dismantling of this myth. Cyrus Thomas, a researcher working for the Bureau, spent more than a decade conducting systematic surveys of mound sites across the eastern United States. His 1894 report, running to 730 pages and examining more than 2,000 mound sites, concluded definitively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples. The conclusion was correct. It was supported by extensive physical evidence, and it was resisted, ignored, and in some institutional contexts actively undermined for years after its publication, because it contradicted a narrative that served specific political purposes, namely, the justification of land dispossession by suggesting that Native Americans had themselves displaced a more advanced predecessor culture and therefore held no special claim to the territory. Roger Kennedy, who served as director of the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian, documented this history in detail in his 1994 book Hidden Cities. The Smithsonian has since formally acknowledged the institutional role it played in suppressing Native American authorship of the mounds. The suppression was real. It was motivated by racism and political convenience, rather than by any legitimate evidentiary dispute. This is what active institutional suppression looks like. It has a paper trail. It has identifiable actors making identifiable decisions for identifiable reasons, and it was eventually corrected, not by outsiders storming the gates, but by researchers within the institution doing better work and insisting that the better work be recognized. Now examine a case of institutional silence that is frequently mischaracterized as active suppression. Since 1993, the area immediately around and beneath the Great Sphinx of Giza has been subject to a moratorium on private excavation maintained by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities under the long-time leadership of Zahi Hawass. This moratorium is real, it is publicly stated policy, and it has had the practical effect of preventing several independent researchers from conducting the subsurface investigations they have proposed. Hawass, who served as Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities from 2002 until 2011, was simultaneously Egypt's most prominent archaeological spokesperson and the primary gatekeeper for excavation permissions at the country's most significant sites. His dual-role researcher and regulator created genuine and documented conflicts of interest that have been criticized by other Egyptologists, including some within the mainstream academic community. In the popular archaeology world, this moratorium is frequently cited as evidence of deliberate concealment, specifically of evidence for an earlier, more advanced civilization beneath the Sphinx enclosure, potentially including underground chambers or a hall of records. This interpretation gained significant traction following the work of geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, who argued in the early 1990s that the weathering pattern on the Sphinx enclosure walls was consistent with water erosion rather than wind erosion, suggesting the monument was carved during a wetter climatic period, potentially as far back as 7,000 to 9,000 BCE. Schoch's analysis has been genuinely contested by mainstream Egyptologists on geological and archaeological grounds. The debate is a legitimate scientific disagreement, not an open and shut case being suppressed. But the moratorium on excavation has prevented the subsurface investigation that might provide additional evidence relevant to the question, and that is a real cost, regardless of whether the moratorium is motivated by scientific caution, preservation policy, national pride, or something else entirely. What the evidence supports is institutional conservatism and access control. What it does not support, in the absence of any direct evidence, is an active, coordinated conspiracy to hide specific findings from the public. The distinction matters. Institutional conservatism is a solvable problem. It yields to persistent, rigorous, publicly conducted research, conducted through legitimate channels. Active conspiracy requires a different response entirely. Treating one as the other produces frustration rather than progress. The case of the Machu Picchu artifacts held by Yale University is worth examining precisely because it shows what genuine institutional accountability looks like when applied consistently. When Hiram Bingham III conducted his 1911 expedition to Machu Picchu under the auspices of Yale University and the National Geographic Society, he removed approximately 46,000 artifacts, ceramics, human remains, metal objects, textiles, and transported them to the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale, where they remained for nearly a century. Peru's legal and diplomatic effort to recover these artifacts began in earnest in the 1980s and continued for more than 2 decades before reaching resolution. The core dispute was over the terms of the original removal, whether the artifacts had been borrowed for study, with the intention of return, as Peru argued, or legally exported, as Yale initially maintained. In 2011, Yale University and the Peruvian government reached a formal agreement. The artifacts were returned to Peru, where they are now housed at a purpose-built museum in Cusco. The case was resolved through diplomatic negotiation, legal process, and sustained public pressure, not through the exposure of hidden documents or the intervention of whistleblowers. This case illustrates something important about the archaeology of institutional accountability. The problem was real artifacts of enormous cultural significance to Peru had been held by an American university for a century under disputed legal circumstances. The problem was documented, disputed openly, and eventually corrected through legitimate institutional processes. The correction took far too long and required far more effort than it should have. But the mechanism that produced the correction was transparency and persistence, not the discovery of a suppressed truth. There is a quieter form of institutional silence that receives less dramatic attention but may ultimately have more impact on what we know and do not know about the ancient world. Archaeological funding is finite, politically influenced, and structurally biased towards sites and questions that fit existing frameworks. A proposal to excavate a site that might produce evidence inconvenient to a well-established theory is less likely to receive funding than a proposal to fill in details of a theory that the relevant granting institution has already invested in supporting. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary operation of institutional self-interest applied to the production of knowledge. The result is archaeological silence, not the silence of concealment, but the silence of questions never asked, investigations never funded, sites never fully excavated. The unexcavated 90% of Göbekli Tepe, the undated lower courses at Sacsayhuaman, the chambers behind the sealed doors in the Queen's Chamber shaft, the full extent of the Stonehenge hidden landscape still being mapped by ground-penetrating radar. These are not suppressed findings. They are unfunded investigations. The distinction is important, and the consequence is the same. We do not know what they would reveal. What remains unexplained is not always hidden. Sometimes it is simply underfunded. Sometimes it is politically inconvenient in ways that have nothing to do with the content of the finding itself. Sometimes it is sitting in a filing cabinet in an archived survey report from 1963, waiting for someone with a different framework to read it and recognize what it is. The history of archaeology is populated with moments exactly like that, with findings that sat unrecognized, unappreciated, or actively resisted until the institutional conditions changed enough to allow them to be seen clearly. The mound builder myth was corrected. The Göbekli Tepe survey data was eventually read by someone who understood what it meant. The Yale artifacts were returned. The muon tomography team published their big void findings in Nature, and Egypt acknowledged them. The system is imperfect, biased, slow, and occasionally corrupt in specific and documented ways. It is also slowly and unevenly self-correcting. The question worth asking is not whether institutions are hiding the truth. The more productive question is what questions the current institutional structure is not equipped to ask and what it would take to ask them. That question does not have a dramatic answer. It has a patient one, and patience, as every stone in this documentary has demonstrated, is something the ancient world understood considerably better than we do. Go back to the quarry, not to any particular quarry, though the one outside Baalbek will do, because it holds the largest work stone any human being has ever shaped. Go back to the moment before the work stopped, before the tools were set down and the workers walked away, and the stone was left in the ground where it has been sitting, undisturbed, for somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years. Someone made a decision in that quarry, a decision to cut something of this size, to invest the organizational resources required to sustain that cutting, to plan for the transport and placement of an object so massive that no civilization since has demonstrated a verified method for moving it. That decision was not made casually. It was made by people who knew what they were doing, people embedded in a tradition of knowledge and practice that made the decision seem not only possible, but reasonable. We have spent 11 parts of this documentary standing next to the results of decisions like that one. The H-blocks at Puma Punku, precise to a fraction of a degree. The sealed chambers inside the Great Pyramid, sitting untouched behind stone doors with copper handles for 4,500 years. The deliberately buried enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, filled in and hidden by the same hands that built them. The polygonal stones of Sacsayhuaman, fitted so tightly that they outlasted every mortar-bonded wall the Spanish built on top of them. The Moai of Easter Island, walking on their curved bases across a volcanic landscape, exactly as the people who built them always said they did. The largest stone in human history, abandoned mid-task in a Lebanese quarry. The hidden twin of Stonehenge, buried for 4.5 millennia beneath the turf of Salisbury Plain. None of these were built by aliens. None of them require a supernatural explanation. Every single one of them was built by human beings, people with hands and minds and social systems and accumulated knowledge, operating within traditions we have not yet fully reconstructed. That is the most radical idea this documentary has offered. Not the hidden chambers, not the suppressed findings, not the stones that shouldn't have been moved. The most radical idea is the simplest one. The people who built these things were more capable than we have been willing to believe. There is a particular quality of arrogance embedded in the assumption that ancient people must have needed help, divine, extraterrestrial, or otherwise to produce results we cannot easily replicate. It is the arrogance of a civilization so impressed by its own technological achievements that it struggles to imagine a different kind of capability, developed through different means, over different timescales, serving different purposes, producing different results. The Rapa Nui remembered how the statues walked. For generations, they held that knowledge in oral tradition, while researchers dismissed it as mythology. Then 2 archaeologists took the tradition seriously, built a replica, attached 3 ropes, and walked it down a road with 18 people. The tradition was correct. It had been correct the entire time. What changed was not the evidence. What changed was the willingness to treat the people who built the monuments as credible sources of knowledge about how they did it. That shift from dismissal to genuine curiosity is the most productive methodological change available to anyone trying to understand the ancient world. What we are left with, after 11 sites and 11 sets of open questions, is not a solved mystery. It is a more precisely defined set of unsolved ones. We know that organized human construction began at least 6,000 years earlier than the standard model predicted, at a site in southeastern Turkey that was deliberately buried and is still mostly underground. We know that a hidden chamber exists inside the Great Pyramid that no person in recorded history has entered. We know that the largest work stone ever shaped by human hands is sitting in a quarry in Lebanon where it was abandoned mid-task, its transport and purpose unknown. We know that the blue stones of Stonehenge stood somewhere unknown for 4 to 5 centuries before they were incorporated into the monument we recognize. We know that the fitted walls of Sacsayhuaman survived an earthquake that collapsed the most advanced European construction technology of the 16th century. These are not speculations. They are documented, surveyed, published physical facts. And collectively, they describe an ancient world that is more organized, more technically sophisticated, more astronomically aware, and more deliberately intentional than the version of ancient history that most of us were given in school. If you want to follow this further, and these questions deserve to be followed further, the research is accessible and ongoing. The Scan Pyramids project publishes its muon tomography data at scanpyramids.com. The German Archaeological Institute maintains public updates on the Göbekli Tepe excavation at dainst.org. Jo Ann van Tilburg's Easter Island statue project at UCLA accepts support and publishes ongoing findings. These are real researchers doing real work, and they welcome genuine public interest. The comment section of this video is, in its small way, part of this too. If something in these 11 parts raised a question that was not answered here, a site not covered, a finding not addressed, a piece of the puzzle that seems to fit somewhere and has not been placed, leave it. The most interesting directions this series has taken have come from people asking questions that the existing outline did not anticipate. Return one final time to the stone of the south. It is still there, in its quarry, bearing the tool marks of the people who cut it. The unfinished undercut still open, the work suspended at the moment the decision was made to stop. It has been there, through the rise and fall of every empire that has existed since it was cut, through every war and earthquake and century of silence. It has outlasted the civilization that shaped it, the civilization that built on top of it, and every civilization that has come since. It is waiting with a patience that makes human history feel very short. We are the inheritors of something we do not understand. Not because it was hidden from us, not because someone decided we should not know, but because understanding it fully requires a quality of attention, a depth of curiosity, and a willingness to sit with unanswered questions that our culture does not always make easy. The stones have been patient for thousands of years. They can afford to wait a little longer. The question is whether we can afford not to look.